On this episode of Skeptiko.
I think some of us are, this is going to sound kind of weird to you maybe, but I think some of us are permitted to, and some of us, it's not part of the plan for our life. It's like it gets in the way of other things we're trying to accomplish with our life. And so it's like that kind of thing is blocked off. Strangely enough, I think that, for instance, in the skeptic believer debate that you have on psychic things, I do feel like some people are really meant to remain skeptical because if they don't, then it affects how they go through their life and things that they're supposed to learn from it.
See, but Andy, that's the kind of almost new agey kind of stuff that drives folks nuts. But here's what's so cool about you is that you went ahead and did the research.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Sakaris, and on this episode, we talk about what's going on with your dreams. You know, it's kind of funny when we think that probably just 20 years ago, it was still widely assumed that dreams were nothing more than random firing of your brain. And while people who are hardcore materialists would still have some kind of version of that today, I think modern psychology and even some parts of neurology are starting to recognize that there might be more to these dreams than they initially thought. And anyone who doesn't think so would certainly want to give a read and give a listen to today's guest, Dr. Andy Paquette. I should say soon to be Dr. Andy Paquette. I don't think he's quite finished that PhD yet. But Andy has a long history of having precognitive dreams. That is, dreams where he sees something that's going to happen before it happens. And as remarkable as that is, what's probably even more remarkable is that he has rigorously recorded all these dreams and then gone about the process of verifying and validating whether or not those dreams are true. And if you want to know how he did that, you can, of course, read his book, Dreamer. You can listen to his past interview here on Skeptiko, or you can listen to this one because I think he covers it as well. You know, one of the points that he talks about in this interview that I found interesting is that it wasn't until he was collaborating with world-renowned psychologist and dream expert Dr. Stanley Krippner that Andy realized that he, in this process, had compiled the largest dream journal in history. Not just currently, in history. Krippner, who is, again, one of the top people in this field, told him, I've never come across anyone in all my research that ever has compiled a dream journal that is this extensive. So it's really quite a remarkable body of data that he's put together. So in this interview, we talk all about that. We talk about these death dreams that are the subject of his most recent paper, and they're fascinating. And then we also talk about how hard it is to get a paper like this published. So it was great having Andy back on Skeptiko. I hope you enjoy this show. One other thing before we jump into the interview, you know, I just had an interview with Dr. Julie Beischel, and I'm going to get that interview out in a few weeks. But one thing she mentioned that I wanted to pass along, there's a conference that she's attending. It's called the Final Transition Conference, and what those folks are doing is really kind of interesting. They're looking at how some of this groundbreaking, cutting-edge research into extended consciousness, in particular near-death experience in medium communication, might prepare families for end-of-life transitions, you know, when people die. So the Final Transition Conference is what it's called. I'll have a link in the show notes. It's coming up in September, but you get some kind of discount if you register early. And they also have a live streaming option. They even give you CE credits if that's something that might be important to you. So check it out. There'll be a link in the show notes. But for now, here's my interview with Andy Paquette. Today we welcome Andy Paquette to Skeptiko. Andy's the author of Dreamer, 20 Years of Psychic Dreams and How They Changed My Life. That leads into one of the reasons that Andy is here today, because he just published a scholarly paper in the Journal of Scientific Exploration titled, Can Death-Related Dreams Predict Future Deaths? It's pretty straightforward. Evidence from a dream journal comprising nearly 12,000 dreams. Andy is a professor in advanced computer graphics in the Netherlands. It's a field he has extensive experience in, having worked in Hollywood on many big name blockbuster motion pictures and TV shows in terms of doing animation work and managing people who do animation. So he's a longtime contributor also to Skeptiko. He's been on the show. He's also hosted a couple of episodes for us a few years back. We haven't heard from him in a little while, so I think it'll be great to catch up. Andy, welcome to Skeptiko. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Alex. It's been a pleasure.
Why don't we start with the beginning and tell people about this body of work and about how you came to write about your precognitive dreams in the first place.
Okay, so anyway, it started primarily because my wife was telling me every once in a while, she'd say, oh, you just dreamt about this, something would happen, and she'd say, well, you dreamt about that, you told me about it. And I'd say, well, yeah, I dreamt about something like that. I can see why you would think that this was precognitive, but that's just a bunch of baloney, obviously. You're just conflating, a poor memory of something I said that's probably generic.
Give us an example of something like that.
Well, this is kind of funny because I had this very powerful dream that I was walking down a street in Amsterdam, got mugged, and actually shot on this particular street in Amsterdam. The dream was so realistic that I actually thought I had died and left my body and gone to see my wife, who at that time was my girlfriend, at her mother's house, which was thousands of miles away in New York. And it was while I was thinking about what it was like to be dead that I realized I was sitting up in my bed awake with my eyes wide open. It was that strong that I didn't even realize I was already awake. But then 2-3 weeks later, I did get mugged on that street in very much the same circumstances. But because of the dream, I decided to fight back, and I escaped these two guys who had assaulted me. And
like some of the details of that are pretty amazing, like the street, the alley, the situation, the number of assailants, all that stuff is matches perfectly with your dream, right?
Yeah, it did. But keep in mind, at the time, I was thinking, okay, yes, it matches. That's an amazing coincidence. I wasn't thinking this is actually a much more amazing coincidence than I was thinking it was. But that's what I was thinking. Now, I had told my wife of that dream before this happened, because I'd called her and I'd said, I just had this horrible dream. I'm coming back to America, and because I was living in Holland at the time. And then when I did get back, the subject of that dream came up, and she says, well, of course that was a precognitive dream. And I was like, no, that's just baloney. And it happened a couple other times. I dreamt about a plane crash with a Ramsey show disaster and some other things. And she kept on saying this, and it kept on really irritating me. So I finally decided, fine, I'll prove it, and I'm going to start writing this stuff down. And I found really quickly that I had a lot of dreams that seemed to relate to future events. It's just that a lot of the dreams were of things that were really insignificant. And so if I hadn't been writing them down, I probably would have forgotten them. But because I was writing them down, I was not only catching these really fairly insignificant moments in my future that were thoroughly unpredictable because they're so strange.
Give folks an example of kind of an idiosyncratic, minor little event that you captured in your dream journal and then found out to be true.
Okay. Well, one time I dreamt that I had gone to the post office and I bought some stamps, and they just handed me a whole block full of dinosaur stamps, which at that time had just been released, so I had never seen them before. So why would I dream about what kind of stamp I'm going to get at the post office? There's absolutely no meaning to it at all. And yet that's what happened later that day. So those kinds of simple things would happen fairly often. But in the middle of all that, I was also catching some of these bigger things. Like I had a couple dreams actually about the 9/11 disaster and some other things like that. The first Gulf War and then the second Gulf War as well. But the thing is that it took that effort, and it was a big effort because I was recording them every night. I was waking up 3-4 times a night. I was risking my wife's displeasure because it kind of annoyed her to have me wake up in the middle of the night and write things down and then turn on the lights.
She's the one who started the whole thing. So
she was, but I mean, I do remember not a few times when she would say, "What the hell are you doing?" I'd be writing in my dream journal. But I kept that up, and I was pretty assiduous about it. Now, one thing that's kind of funny about not having an opportunity to really see examples of other people doing the same thing is it becomes very easy to become isolated in your knowledge and not have the ability to compare it. I didn't realize I was starting the compilation of one of the largest dream journals that anyone would ever likely see. At the time, it seemed to me that there were probably millions of people who were keeping journals that were as detailed as mine. I later found out that wasn't the case, but at the time, it just seemed normal, and I just kept on doing it. It was so interesting that I didn't stop for a long, long time. And this is also because the dreams got more interesting than just precognitive dreams. They started going into other subject matter like ghosts and reincarnation, spiritual dreams, healing, lots and lots of things like that. They just went way beyond simple precognition. In fact, precognition became so uninteresting to me that at a certain point, I decided I wasn't going to bother writing them down anymore, unless I thought if it turned out this was a precognitive dream, would it be an interesting precognitive dream?
Andy, let's just touch on a couple of those topics there. I mean, number one, did your dreaming become more intense, more spiritual, deeper as you started recording your dreams? Or do you think maybe your recording of your dreams helped you remember your dreams more, and therefore you found them to be what they really were all along? So is it kind of a memory thing, or did the journaling actually kind of spur your dreams to kind of take you deeper? And then also maybe touch on the idea of lucid dreaming as well, because I think that's a term that people are familiar with, and they'd want to know, is this part of a lucid dreaming process on your part?
It went through both of those processes. I mean, it did help my memory. And in that way, I think that it kind of cultivated, or what some people would say incubated, dreams that maybe wouldn't have happened otherwise, because I was directing my attention inward in a way that I hadn't been doing before. But on the other hand, I think I always had the propensity for this kind of dream, because I do remember dreams from my childhood that were out of body experiences. I mean, at the time, I just thought they were interesting flying dreams or whatever. And I remember one very clearly. I was something like 7 years old. I was going to Harper Academy in San Jose, California. And I had this dream that I went to a part of the school I'd never been to before, and I was flying around looking at all the facilities there. And it was very exciting. And the next day I woke up, and I'm this little kid, and I went in, and I had this friend named Diane Singleton, and I said, Diane, hey, I told her all about this dream, and I said, let's go see if it really looks like it did in my dream. And it did. And I just thought, oh, well, that's an amazing coincidence. And of course, the skeptics today would say, oh, you probably saw it while you weren't paying attention. Okay, fine. But there were a lot of those things. And then when I get older, I have other things where it's absolutely impossible for me to have had any normal knowledge of the thing. And I think it's more appropriate to classify that as a genuine OBE. So I've had those things. And I used to dream about spiritual things before I was interested in spirituality. I mean, I considered myself an atheist for a great part of my life. And while I was an atheist, I was dreaming about angels and about religious figures from the Christian theology for the most part. But I didn't really know anything about that, but I was dreaming about them anyway. I started doing yoga when I was in New York in my early 20s. And I remember one guy at the Integral Yoga Institute I don't know if it's fair to say that he wanted to take credit for me having interesting dreams because I was getting good at yoga, or if it just was the logical explanation for him. But I have to say that I was having this stuff before I was doing yoga. I will admit, though, that I did actually get fairly advanced in my asana performing. So I was able to do some pretty tricky yoga poses, as I think if you've seen me.
You have the photos to prove it. And me, as someone who's done hatha yoga or yoga asanas, I guess we should say, for 25 years, can attest that, I mean, I've only run across a couple people in my life who can do the poses that you can do. And I can't do anything close to that.
Yeah, well, now that I'm getting on in years, it's harder now for me too. But in any event, yeah, so yeah, I think it helped train me, but I think that the ability was always there. And frankly, this is going to sound kind of strange to some of your listeners, but I think it's always been something that was meant to happen in my life. I don't believe that something that's had this large of an impact on my life could possibly be an accident. I think it was just part of my life plan for some reason.
So, Andy, let me then bring you back, because I know I'm peppering you with a lot of questions, but we've talked about this so many times, but I'm changing too and learning and advancing. So, it's a chance for me to kind of reacquaint myself with this amazing experience that you've had and combine that with, the scholarly and intellectual ability you have to analyze it. I think is just kind of a rare opportunity. But sort out for me lucid dreaming, out-of-body experience dreaming, if you will, spiritual dreaming. What in your mind are the differentiators? What are the different qualities? I mean, how do you pull that apart?
Okay, well, the first thing is when I wake up and I'm willing to write down in my dream journal that I've had a lucid dream, it's because I remember that I knew that I was dreaming during the dream. Simple as that, not a big deal. I suspect that I have a lot more lucid dreams than I remember having had when I wake up. I think some dreams, it just doesn't occur to me to think about that because it's so obvious that I'm dreaming. So it's not really an issue.
Now, when you say lucid dreaming, do you mean total control lucid dreaming, where you can control all the elements, partial control, memory? I mean, how do you break down the idea of lucid dreaming? And for folks who aren't familiar, if we're throwing out that term and you don't know what it is, lucid dreaming just means dreaming, only being aware that you're dreaming in the dream, and therefore having some degree of control over where the dream goes. And, probably 20 years ago, this was like a really controversial, oh, this doesn't really happen. It's like out-of-body experience and astral projection. There's no such thing. Only now they've proven in laboratories that lucid dreaming is in fact happening. And they do there's been some interesting experiments, REM and other stuff that shows that, yeah, this is a real phenomenon that people have.
Yeah, well, one thing about my definition of lucid dreaming is it differs quite a bit from Robert Wagner's. And frankly, I think Robert is pretty interesting for this reason. In his case, he has these lucid dreams where he tries to have lucid dreaming, and he's able to exert a certain amount of mental influence over the content of his dreams as a result of actually succeeding at this and having these lucid dreams. In my case, when I have a lucid dream, all I mean by that is I'm aware. I make no effort at all to control them. And frankly, I don't like to. The reason is because when I find myself exerting control in a dream, and they don't have to be lucid for that to happen. In fact, rather often, when I'm not lucid, it happens, and I find that the entire dream is essentially destroyed because of that. Because instead of paying attention to the information that's coming at me, I'm trying to change the information, and it has the effect of ruining the translation, as it were. So the way Robert talks about it is a bit different from that. And frankly, I haven't had that kind of lucid dreaming experience. I don't really try for it either. I don't know why, but I've always had an aversion to trying to manipulate my dreams like that because I think they're interesting enough without having to do that. So I don't really try to. For me, my goal, if I become lucid in a dream, is simply to go along with it and see what it is that I'm supposed to get out of the dream. I remember one dream where this guy kept essentially trying to wake me up within the dream. He tried it 3 times, and finally, what worked was he asked me to smell some herbs. This is actually fairly common. I'll have these dream characters will have me do something that's a sensory experience of some kind, like drinking tea or smelling an herb or whatever. And that has the effect, strangely enough, of waking me up in the dream. And then I suddenly am aware that I'm dreaming. And then this dream character will say to me, okay, now that you're here, now that you can actually pay attention to me, and now that you're not like dragging away, all of my attempts to give you a message, now we can talk. And then they'll usually give me a message or show me something or ask me to do something. And it tends to be a spiritual nature. So in that particular case, he brought me to some kind of a hospital in the Middle East, and he was showing me all these patients, and he wanted me to spiritually help them on a healing level. So
Andy, when you enter that kind of dream, okay, so I'm glad you made that differentiation in terms of lucid dream and lucidity, and there's a whole way we could break that down, but let's move on and talk about the spiritual aspect. When you enter that realm, that dimension, whatever we want to call it, where do you think you are? Are you in the same place that we all are when we dream, or are you in a different place? Can we all access that spiritual realm that you access through dreaming?
I think some of us are, this is going to sound kind of weird to you maybe, but I think some of us are permitted to, and some of us really it's not part of actually I say it's not part of the plan for our life. It's like it gets in the way of other things we're trying to accomplish with our life. And so it's like that kind of thing is blocked off. But I think a lot of people probably do this without realizing it. That when they sleep, they essentially are freed of their physical constraints, and then they do these things which they tend to forget when they wake up. And I think there's a reason for forgetting. It's because if they remember, in a lot of cases, it would affect decisions they make while they're awake, and that would change the experience they have in their waking state, which may actually interfere with or ruin experiences that they're supposed to have. So strangely enough, I think that, for instance, in the skeptic believer debate that you have on psychic things, I do feel like some people are really meant to remain skeptical because if they don't, then it affects how they go through their life and things that they're supposed to learn from it. Other people, are supposed to be able to produce this kind of information so that it's there for those who are ready to accept it.
See, but Andy, that's the kind of almost new agey kind of stuff that drives folks nuts. And it really is, because people go, but here's what's so cool about you is that you went ahead and did the research. You can say that, you can form these opinions and share these opinions, but then when someone pushes you, you can say, okay, here's the research, here's what I did to record it, here's not only the 12,000 dreams in my journal, but here's the database breakdown of all of them. So, at some point, I guess we should probably transition into picking up on this story. You start recording these dreams, you start having this amazing dream journal, you realize it's kind of an amazing dream journal, you realize these dreams are just completely out of this world, literally. I mean, you're in this other dimension, you're moving through you're meeting these spirit beings and all this, but at the same time, the scientist in you is trying to figure out how to catalog this stuff and make it somewhat understandable in terms of scientific terms. Tell us how that played into this.
Oh boy, you gave me like three things to chew on, and I really want to say two things really fast, okay? On the New Age subject, for the most part, New Age stuff drives me bananas because it's not evidence-based, okay? In the few cases where I think there is some evidence behind it, that doesn't bother me so much. But I do see a lot of things that come from, as far as I'm concerned, they have no justification for the claims they make, and it does bother me too. So I just wanted to state that clearly. As far as the evidence is concerned, you made a statement there. It's not completely accurate. I didn't realize that these things were unusual for a very long time. I'm not even sure it really hit me until I was living in Holland and I talked to Stanley Krippner for the first time in 2009 or something like that. I knew that it was unusual to have precognitive dreams and write them down and then check them out, but I didn't know how unusual it was. The reason is because I had read some books at the Parapsychology Foundation in New York, and it seemed to me, if I was interested in reading a book about this type of psi ability or that kind, they always had a book or a paper to read. And so I developed this impression that researchers in this field had like thousands or even millions of cases to choose from. And there were probably thousands of people like me around who were doing this kind of thing. So I really didn't know how unusual this was until I actually started looking into those records myself when I started researching this. And that happened right around 2010 when I decided I was going to write some journal articles. Now, just before that, I did become aware that some of the more spiritual dreams I've had are extremely unusual. It kind of came as a surprise to me too, because I thought that, for instance, Christians or people of any religious stripe most likely dreamt often about God and religious subjects because they have a need to do this. So they would go to bed every night thinking, "Gee, I hope I dream of God or Jesus or Allah or whatever," and then they would pray to the Hindu deities or Jesus or whatever, and then they would dream about them. But then I ran across some research by a guy named Kelly Bukele, who looked into that very question, and he found that actually very few people ever dream of those kinds of characters, even when they really want to. And so when I looked at my own dreams in that context, I realized, oh, wait a minute, I actually have a lot of these, a lot more than most people do. So I knew that was unusual, but it was when I was talking to Stanley Krippner, and he expressed some real surprise that I had accumulated as many records as I did, and that I had actually managed to validate so many of them, that I suddenly realized that my database is extremely unusual. And I hope he doesn't mind that I keep saying this, but I think it was a really great comment. He said that as far as he knew, there were only 2 dream databases that came close, and he wasn't sure that either one of them on their own was the equal. One was because the quality was about the same, but the quantity was less, and the other, the quantity was about the same, but the quality was less. So at that point, I was thinking, okay, I'm probably sitting on a relatively unique database here.
And partially because you are this computer scientist in another life, and you do understand database. You do. So I would just imagine, I'm guessing here, but I would imagine once you started to really try and organize these in any way, you were already compiling a database, even if you weren't compiling a database.
Yeah, well, what happened was I had a lot of my physical dream journals got damaged in a flood in Phoenix, of all places, the driest place on earth. And I thought I'd better go ahead and transcribe all these things. So I started transcribing them into a Word file. Now, that's what I used when I was writing my book. But then when I started writing my first couple of papers, I thought, this really isn't good enough working with it like this. And I started making Excel documents that would allow me to sort the data, but that really wasn't good enough either. So when I decided to write this paper that we're eventually going to talk about, I realized I had to have a real proper database. There's no way around it. I had kind of resisted doing it because I knew it was going to take me a long time to get it put together. But this paper literally had its genesis probably in about 2011, when I realized that the only way to do this death dream study was to find all the death dreams. And to do that, I absolutely had to make the database because I needed to code all the dreams with terms that would allow me to find things easily and to be able to sort them properly. So it took me a solid 2 years just to prepare that database. And by the time I'd done that, I was already deep into writing other papers and I was working on my PhD. But I kept at this thing and I kept on having more dreams. So the thing is, even after I'd established the database, I now had like another 600 dreams to add to it or something. And those all had to be coded. So it really took a lot of time just to develop the raw material I was going to work with. And this is one of the things I really hope your listeners appreciate, because the kind of study that this is would be almost impossible to do for just about anybody in the world who doesn't have the database I have. It would be really hard. I mean, it's 25 years worth of dreams that yield 8 really interesting cases. Okay. And this is me making a huge effort to record them over a long period of time, starting when I know nothing about research methods, starting when I don't even know about other research in the field. I'm just doing it because it's interesting. And I kind of had to start at that point, because if I had waited until I understood this stuff, it'd all be over. I'm in middle age, I hate to admit. And how much time do I have left to start something like that? I don't know. But the point is that it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of dedication, and it takes some knowledge and it takes some expertise as well. Not everyone is going to be suited to making this kind of a database or analyzing it the way I did, or
verifying it, because let's add that. You mentioned that, but I mean, let's break down the process, how it works. You have a dream, you record the dream, and then you go about, in many cases, trying to validate the information that came through in dream, right? Tell us that process.
The way it started out was Kitty had said I was having precognitive dreams. Okay, so that's easy enough to check out. I write the dream down, and if something later seems to match it, then I can compare the two. I can compare the written record with the thing that happens and decide, well, this is similar enough that it looks like it's a legit example of a precognitive dream.
Let's add in there, from a scientific standpoint, that would be rather weak, right? I mean, because it's just one person's account, and you're not only having the precognitive dreams, but you're the one who's validating the precognitive dream. You have no third party validation whatsoever. So scientifically, that wouldn't be really strong, right?
Well, okay, if it was exactly as you said, yes, and that does fit some of the examples, but not all of them, because I do have third party independent verification of elements in some cases.
Exactly. So that's what I was trying to lead you into. Explain how that works then.
Okay, well, sometimes it'd be a dream of, for instance, something that's independently verifiable, like a Time magazine cover. Okay, so the Time magazine cover would come out. This is a physical object, and then you could verify that the drawing in my journal matches that. Of course, at that point, you're trusting that I've dated it properly. So we'll go a step further. So then I'm having out-of-body experiences that match events in the lives of people I know. And then I've, in a couple of cases, had those people send me letters to verify, yes, I called them out of the blue to ask them to validate this dream. And in fact, it did match up fairly well with circumstances in their life in some other part of the world. Like my friend Richard Breeden, who's a high energy physicist, was working in Tokyo at the time. I had a couple of OBE dreams with him in them. And he was actually very skeptical, and I don't know if it annoyed him to have to verify them for me, but he was highly skeptical, and yet he did verify them nevertheless, because as a honest researcher, he knows what he saw.
So you called him up and said, "Hey, Richard, I had this dream about you, and it seemed pretty significant for me. I want to review the dream, and I want you to tell me if this really happened in your life or not."
That's how I would have done it the second or third or fourth time. But the first time was a little different because I had never called anybody to verify this kind of thing before. So I called him from New York to Japan at a time when I could barely afford a transatlantic call. So this was expensive, and it was one of the few times I've ever made a call like that. But I called him up, and I actually eased into it. I said, "Richard, how are you? I had a dream about you last night. It was kind of funny." And I was kind of not giving him any idea that I thought it was significant, although I had it sitting written down in my journal right in front of me. But I said, "Yeah, I dreamt you were, sitting at this table. You had a little box there, and you're cutting up these things, and they had these letters on them, like Scrabble tiles, and then you're throwing them in the box." And he was like, "That's basically what I was doing last night." He was labeling these circuit boards. He was cutting them into little pieces, and then giving them these alphabetical labels that made them look like Scrabble tiles, and then tossing them in a box. And so he was really surprised by that. But I didn't at first clue him into the fact that I thought it was possible he was going to recognize it. After that, though, I was pretty clear about it. I was like, I had a dream, I want to verify it. And to be fair, there were times when I'd call somebody up and they weren't able to verify it. They'd say, "No, I don't think that happened." But that was actually less common than people who did verify them. And sometimes it happened that I would say a dream to someone, or I'd describe a dream to someone. This happened with Dr. David Ryback, a guy who wrote a book called Dreams That Come True, where I'd had a dream about him, and I described it to him. He says, "No, that didn't happen." And I said, "I didn't say the events in the dream happened to you. I dreamt that somebody told you about the events and that they had happened to that other person." And then he said, "Oh, yeah, that happened this morning in the parking lot. This guy who works in the same office building that I do, that I don't even know, was telling me about this amazing coincidence where his two cars got destroyed in two different storms."
Now, so, and that's one that you told previously on Skeptiko, but let me jump in there because someone's going to go, "Oh, file drawer problem. He's throwing away the ones that don't match." Or they're going to say, "Oh, he's fishing for more information." But maybe it's worth quickly retelling the complexity of this dream and the unlikeliness that this guy would have any association with anyone who had this kind of experience.
Okay, and by the way, one thing I should mention about that file drawer effect, because that's what this current article is partially about, is that because I have the database, I know exactly how often anybody appears in the journal. So for instance, if I'm typing it in right now, I type in the name David Ryback, or just Ryback, and I get 27 dreams total out of 25 years. Okay, I just did that right now. I just did a search. I haven't read them. For all I know, some of these are not in a context that would make them dreams about David Ryback. But that's 27 out of almost 12,000 dreams. Already that's telling you the file drawer effect is not a likely culprit here. But in this particular case, I dreamt that I saw David talking to a guy in a parking lot, and this guy was telling him how he owned two cars, and both of them had gotten destroyed in two separate incidents in the same way, where a tree branch had fallen and crushed the roof of the car. But it was two separate storms. So that's actually a very unusual pairing of events. And keep in mind, he lived in Atlanta, Georgia. I lived in New Jersey at the time. And I really wasn't exactly following the local weather in other parts of the country.
Even if you were following the weather, why does it lead to the fact that the guy a tree would fall down and crush somebody's car? So you tell this guy, hey, I had this dream, and I think somebody told you about this extraordinary thing where they lost two of their cars in weather storms, and boom, he says, yeah, that happened. I mean, how many times has that happened in his life where someone told him, hey, something amazing happened to me. I have two cars, and in two separate incidents of weather anomalies, they both got crushed. I mean, that's a once in a lifetime thing.
Yeah, and in the same week, by the way. But yes, and another one was a professor of mine. I dreamt about him and the sensation of allowing bees to sting me, and it was really weird because I didn't feel it, but I knew it was happening. I had this really bizarre, creepy feeling that my body was reacting, and yet it wasn't reacting. And so when I told him about it, he said that at the time I was having that dream, approximately, because it's very hard to get these things exact, but most likely within an hour or two, he was on the phone with a friend of his who was partially paralyzed, and the treatment was to allow herself to be stung in exactly the way I had described. And it felt the same way to her as I described it to Ron. So the way she was telling about it, it was like she was aware of this thing. She could tell that she was being stung. And yet she didn't have the physical pain that was associated with that. And it was a really creepy sensation, I tell you. Even just describing the dream now, I can remember what it felt like. It was horrible. But yeah, that's like who gets apitherapy. That's what that's called. It's bee sting therapy. He's the only person I have ever met in my entire life that I know of that has any connection to that. And yet on the one night that I dream about that subject, he's actually had something happen in his day that's pertinent to it. So
Andy, at this point, your mind has to be exploding in terms of all the stuff that's happening to you. Although, as we heard about when we talked to you a few years ago, you've had a lot of strange experiences kind of throughout your life. I love the backgammon story and multiple ones, but we won't get into that. Just that you're not unfamiliar with kind of extended consciousness, kind of strange things. But again, what I think is just amazing, and having known you for several years and talked to you over the years, is you kept pushing back in terms of how does this fit into science? What can we do scientifically with this data? And I think it's pushed you to really do some just innovative, groundbreaking kind of work in terms of what to do with this kind of database and what it means for all anomalous anecdotal accounts. And I'm going to put anecdotal in air quotes because I think the real breakthrough here is you were seeking a way to take these accounts and take them out of the realm of this, oh, we can dismiss that because it's just an anecdote. And you wanted to find a way to bring it back into science as we understand science.
Yeah, well, I call them spontaneous experiences as opposed to anecdotal. And the difference between this, as far as looking at research on the subject is concerned, is that an anecdote is really something that has no data behind it. It doesn't really have any kind of evidence-based validation. A spontaneous experience might have that, even if it's spontaneous, even if it isn't generated purposely for the purpose of an experiment. And in this particular case, you could say in a way that this is like a 25-year-long experiment on my part, where I just want to see what happens over the course of this 25 years. But as far as getting into the data, when I realized how unusual my database was, I started noticing a lot of gaps in literature that I could actually answer. Things where that have to do with spontaneous experiences in particular, because generally speaking, spontaneous experiences are not common and rarely reported. And when they are reported, it's a lot of times not with any kind of documentation attached to it. Whereas in my case, I have a very large body of documentation, and which means essentially that they're all reported. And this allows me to look into some questions like the Fowler effect. So when we get to this death dream article, for instance, I wasn't trying to come up with another idea for an article when I decided to do this. It was something happened, I had a dream, and I looked it up, and I realized that I had buried in my journal already an answer to a question I hadn't even ever bothered asking. And then I thought, well, I wonder if I've got any more examples like that in the journal. So this is an example of me not seeing something that was psi in my journal at the time it happened, but later asking myself, if I look at the data this way, if I just find examples that match this criteria, is there going to be anything there? And I found that there actually were quite a lot of dreams, and it has to do with dreams about people who have died. What I was wondering is that do I have dreams of people that have died that I didn't know had died that I can now validate have died or not, and then compare the dates in my journal with when they actually died and see if anything comes out of that. And one thing that I found was really interesting about it is not only did I have a few examples of those kinds of dreams, not only did I get an idea of how rare they are, but I also found that the standard test for validating a dream about a person's death as precognitive or in any way psychic is that you have the dream before they die, and it's very close in time to when they die. But I found several examples where the dream was after they died, but it was still so close to their death that it was actually meaningful because that person didn't appear on any other occasion in the entire journal. So I've got examples where I've got one dream about one person who, in this particular case that I'm thinking of right now, is a stranger. And the only dream I ever have about this one person out of 12,000 dreams, or nearly 12,000 dreams, is about their death, and they died 2 weeks earlier.
So walk us through some examples, and I think what you're going to have to really nail down there is for people like when you say you had a dream about them and then you found out they had died 2 weeks earlier. People are going to immediately say, well, then you could have known somehow, some way that they were dead. So
well, of course.
Handle all and this is like basics, ABC kind of stuff that I'm sure you thought about the first 5 minutes you thought about this problem. But still, it's the question that people ask that immediately pops into their head. So walk us through how you verify that you really have something here.
Okay, well, I had this one dream where a woman came to me and was telling me that a person I knew who happened to be a clerk at a store I had been to maybe 5 times in my life had a person close to him, a relative, had just died. And that he was really despondent about this. As a result, he was abusing drugs and alcohol, and she warned me that he would die if he continued abusing these things. And she told me that she wanted me to go talk to him and give him this warning that she was giving me.
So this is more or less like a complete stranger. It's somebody who works at the grocery store.
And I have talked to the guy. I mean, I bought a couple of things from him. I did know his first name, but we hadn't really talked about anything other than, is this paint available and where is it? That's kind of the extent of our couple of conversations. And it was in a new city too. I just moved to Phoenix, so it's not like I knew the area very well either. But anyway, I went upstairs and I told my wife about the dream, and she was like, so are you going to go talk to him? And I was like, are you kidding me? Go up to this guy I don't know and give him this weird dream? I mean, what if he hasn't had a relative die? That's going to be really kind of embarrassing, wouldn't it be? And she said, and she really insisted. She was like, you have to do this. You have to do it. And she was so insistent that I was like, okay, fine. But it was a pain because the store was like 45 minutes away from where I lived by car, which means also it's kind of expensive gas-wise. So I drove all the way down there, and I get to the store and I see this guy behind the counter, and I'm like, oh great, how do I do this? So I said to him, and I don't want to use his real name here, I'm going to just call him Frank. Okay. But I said, so Frank, and I gave the name of some shipment that he might have had. I said, did you get those? What's it? Is it yet? And he said, oh yeah, they're in the back. And I was like, okay. And I did this because I wanted to take him away from this big cluster of people that was in front of the store. so I could have this private conversation. So we get to the back of the store, and I said, it's kind of a funny thing. I had a dream about you last night. And he looked at me kind of, quizzically, like he was wondering what that meant. And he said, "Oh, nothing bad, I hope." And I was like thinking, "Well, yeah, actually, it's pretty bad." So I said, "Well, it wasn't. Let me just put it to you this way: Have you had a very close relative die recently?" And he said, "Yes, I did." And I said, "Okay, well, I had this young woman come to me in this dream, and I described her to him." And she said that somebody, and only at this point did it occur to me that the person who came to me in the dream was the person who died. Okay. This oftentimes doesn't hit me until later. But anyway, so it was while I was talking to him that I realized this. And I said, "So she told me that you were very upset about this and you were abusing alcohol. Because of it, and that you're going to die as a result." I did not mention the drugs because I didn't want him to feel like my next call was going to be the police to have him arrested. So I just mentioned the alcohol. And I said, "So does this make any sense to you?" And he said, "It's true. My sister-in-law, who I was very close to, got killed in a car crash. I think it wasn't like 2 weeks earlier, but it was almost 2 weeks earlier. It was like 10 days earlier or something like that. She was parked at a stoplight, and a police car involved in a high-speed car chase rammed the back of her car, and she was killed instantly." And he was despondent, and he said he was abusing alcohol a lot, and he didn't say anything about drugs either, I suppose for the same reason. And then he said something that kind of surprised me. He said that he'd had a dream of her also earlier in the week where she'd given him the exact same message. She'd said, "If you don't get over this, if you don't stop abusing this stuff, you will die. You need to stop." So she told him the same thing she told me, which to me, that was like the real validation. Okay. Now, I didn't even know her name. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his last name. So, if there had been some kind of police blotter report about this, I wouldn't have had any way to connect it to him because I didn't know what the guy's last name was. Do you know what I mean? In fact, and this is one of the interesting things about this paper, I didn't know his last name until I did this paper, which is like, I think 7-8 years later, something like that. I had to research it. I actually had to get somebody in the United States, call around to figure out who this guy was because I had never known what his last name was. And once they found who he was, then I had that person look for, believe it or not, like police blotter newspaper articles, and they couldn't find anything on this, even though they had the name, because it wasn't in any of those kinds of sources. But eventually, I was able to get a hold of some kind of report. I forget what it was offhand. I think it was a memorial service type of a report where the church where she was buried mentioned some of the details about it. But it was not something that was really covered in a public way. And even if it had been, there would be no reason for me to connect it to this single guy. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes total sense. So this then becomes one of the cases that you looked at in this paper. Can dream-related dreams predict future deaths?
Yeah, and the funny thing is that to me the really exciting thing about this paper is that I didn't know what I was going to find. When I'd written other articles, it was about things that I had already found, things that I already knew had happened, and I noticed that there was a vacancy in the literature, and I thought, well, if I write about this, I can add to the literature a little bit in this area or that area. But this one, I just suspected something was going on. And if you don't mind my describing another one of these, I'll tell you the one that gave me the idea for the paper. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. A long time ago, my mom had a friend. Again, I'm not going to use her real name, but I'll just call her Susan. And she had been very close to our family for a while. Okay. I was a little kid the last time I saw her. I was maybe 9 years old, something like this. But we had actually lived with them for a little while, maybe for 2-3 months, something like that, when I was in 7th grade. And that was the last I saw her. My mom had a falling out with her. I believe, strangely enough, it was about religion, because this lady and her husband were Christian, and I think my mom thought they were trying to push it on us too much or something. But anyway, and they thought my comic book collection was of the devil, which I thought was ridiculous. But in any event, I hadn't seen her in a long time. And then one night in, I think it was 2010 or something, I had a dream about her. And I had the feeling in the dream that she had died, and that she was coming to like basically give me a blessing or that kind of a thing. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I asked my mom to see if this lady had died, but she had moved. My mom had moved, the lady had moved, I had moved, all of us had moved. None of us knew where any of the other people were. And the last time my mom knew where this gal was like 25 years earlier. So she did a bit of research and came up with nothing. But then a year later, I had decided I was really going to pursue this article. So I asked her again, because the first time when that didn't go anywhere, I just kind of decided to drop it. But a year later, I thought, no, I really have to do this article. So I asked my mom to please pin it down. And she found her. And she had died in 2010, the same year as my dream. Now, the interesting thing was I didn't remember having ever dreamt about her before. Okay. So what that would mean is the only dream I had of her in my entire dream journal is of her dying or me thinking she's dead because of the context of the dream in the same year that she actually died. And to me, I thought statistically that would be kind of interesting because this goes completely against the file drawer effect idea, which is you have like 10,000, 20,000 dreams of a certain person, and then when they die, you just attach the most recent dream to it. Well, in this case, I was pretty sure I hadn't dreamt about her. So thanks to my database, I typed in her name and I found out I had dreamt about her only once before, 19 years earlier, and there was nothing in the dream that would suggest that she had died. So the only dream that suggested her death at all was in the year of her actual death. And the only other dream was 19 years previously. There's this incredible desert between the two. So when I saw that, I was thinking, holy cow, I wonder if there are people who I have never even bothered to check to see if they've died because it was too difficult to do. Because like in this lady's case, I thought it was curious enough that I was willing to try, but there are other people that I dreamt of as having died or as ghosts. And I just thought it'd be too hard to find out if it was true or not. So I never even bothered. But for this article, I thought, let's see if I can find out if there's anyone else like that. So I found every single dream that could be construed as death related. And then I found out all the people who were involved in those. And of course, I can do this because I've got this searchable database now. I had to read all of these dreams to see that they really were death related, because in some cases it was just like I'd used the word death or die, or one of the search terms I was using, and it was in an innocuous context. So like in one case, I had a dream where this chameleon had what I described as a death grip on my finger. So obviously dreams like that don't mean anything in this context anyway.
Let's talk about statistics. What you've really broken some ground on here is tying these, what you call spontaneous, what other people would call anecdotal accounts, to statistical measures that social scientists are really comfortable with, and psychologists like Dr. Daryl Bem, who assisted you greatly after you brought him in on the process in doing this. So tell us about that interface of statistics and these accounts.
Daryl was great, I have to say. What happened was I submitted this to the Journal of Scientific Exploration quite a while ago. I think it was March of last year. And I got a whole raft of comments, almost all of which had to do with statistics.
We should back up and tell people, in case they don't know, who Daryl Bem is. And in the process, I really want to tell people about this process and about this journal, the Journal of Scientific Exploration. Because again, we can say we don't have to pay any attention to the skeptics, but of course we do. Of course we have to pay attention to the skeptics. And if you mention the Journal of Scientific Exploration to skeptics, it gets, this rolling of the rolling of the eyes and the shrugging of the shoulders, like, oh my gosh, I wanted you to tell people what you went through, what the process was like, what the peer review process was like, what the acceptance process was like, what the editorial process was like, and what the standards were like for getting your paper in this journal.
Yeah, actually, I'll say that for the other two also. Every paper I've submitted to them was initially rejected. They said they were interesting subjects, but they needed me to explain myself a lot better. And I think I, in every case, went through a minimum of 2 drafts. In the case of this article, I think I went through about 6, something like that. But I felt they were very rigorous. And actually, I think people who roll their eyes at this particular journal are really ill-informed, frankly. I mean, never mind the fact that they've got Nobel laureates who founded the journal and who are active or play an active role in the location. They also have really prominent researchers who are publishing in this journal. In fact, actually, if I want to find good articles on these kinds of subjects, really rigorous articles by people who know what they're talking about, I'm more likely to find them here than in almost any other location, not only because they are willing to publish it, but because good researchers like to publish in this journal. Finally, what happened was I got an email from their associate editor, I think, or their editor-in-chief, Kathleen Erickson, and she said, well, here's the thing. We've got this feedback from the people who've read your paper, the peer reviewers, and they like the subject. They like your take on it. They really need the statistics to be more solid. So what we'd like to suggest is that you work with our associate editor, Daryl Bem, on this, and have him take a look at it and then go from there.
Who is Daryl Bem, and what kind of tables and questions was he asking?
Okay, by the way, I think you know more about Daryl Bem than I do, but he is a prominent researcher, primarily well known for an article on precognition that he did a while back, where subjects were found to anticipate responses in a precognition test, where they were going to be shown symbols. And one of them, this is, I think, what got all the attention, was pornographic, one was violent, one was sedate, different kinds of scenes or images. And he found that they had physical reactions based on, I guess it was electrodes or something that was attached to their body before the content came up. And it was consistent for certain types of content. So they were able to link the content that they were getting after this galvanic response. Even though the person wasn't even aware that they were having this physical response to the images that they were going to be shown that hadn't been shown to them yet.
Right, and he made the rounds on all the talk shows and even made it to like the mainstream talk shows like Colbert Report and that kind of stuff. But what's also interesting about Daryl Bem is that as a social psychologist, he was kind of, I don't know about world famous, but he was certainly very, very famous in the field in terms of non-parapsychology related stuff when he published that paper a few years ago on this psi effect. So he's a bigwig as a social psychologist, and then he became somewhat of a bigwig in parapsychology and psi. So yeah.
Well, by the way, as long as you mention that, I might as well mention also that he's a professor emeritus at Cornell University, which is not a tiny thing to achieve.
So Andy, tell you what, people need to go and check out this paper. What is the exact future of this paper in terms of it's going to be in the JSE, which people can't get, or is it going to be, where is it going to be published? Are people going to be able to read this, and when is it going to be out and available?
It's going to be in the Journal of Scientific Exploration June issue, which should be out in about 2 weeks from the date we're recording this. And the way they do it at the JSE, if you're a subscriber, you have access to it immediately. And if you're not a subscriber, they make all of their articles available for free on the internet a year after it was published. Okay. And I don't know I haven't read the fine print of my agreement with them, so I don't know if I'm allowed to post the paper to ResearchGate or something so other people can download it. I'd have to ask them about that. I presume that they want subscribers, so they'd rather I not do that until a year has passed. So I'd have to check. But it will be available that way. And I will say that getting a subscription to Journal of Scientific Exploration is not expensive, and it's kind of a good journal, actually. So you'd get lots of interesting articles in there. And I actually don't think it's a bad way to support the parapsychology research in general. But one thing also I want to say about this that I think is probably the most important takeaway for me is that if it took me 25 years of really serious effort that, like Stanley Krippner has only seen the like of twice in his entire life, you're not likely to get articles like this very often from anybody. And any skeptic who's going to pull out the file drawer effect cannot possibly have any data to base that argument on, in this context anyway. When it comes to death dreams, there is no way anyone in the entire world has more data than I do on this exact subject. It's just impossible.
We'll all make sure that we look for these papers that are coming out, but also for the sequel, the follow-on to your book Dreamer, which folks can find on Amazon.com or through your website, which we'll have linked up in the show notes. Andy, it's been a long conversation, but we could probably go on. I really only asked about half the questions I really wanted to ask, but it's such a fascinating topic. We'll have to do it again when one of these other papers come out. It's been great having you on Skeptiko. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, it's no problem. It's my pleasure.
Thanks again to Andy for joining me today on Skeptiko. One question to tee up from this interview, that is, have you ever had any precognitive dreams? In particular, have you ever had any dreams related to someone's death? I thought as a follow-on to this conversation, we might talk about your amazing dreams, precognitive dreams, death-related dreams, whatever. I'd love to hear from you about that. Of course, you can drop me an email, pop over to the forum, connect with me there. Connect with me on Facebook. I'm really going to try and reach out on Facebook and Twitter more and more in the future. So if you can, connect with me there as well. Of course, the way to get to the Skeptiko show is through the Skeptiko website at skeptiko.com. And you can download all these shows, all 281 of them or whatever the number is, right there on the website for free. There's no obligation. We don't ask for any money. There's no donations. There's no advertising. Just a little bit of good old-fashioned internet sharing. So take advantage of it if you like it. And please tell other people I like sharing, and I love when you share what I'm sharing with you with others. It's a great joy of mine. So please do it in whatever way you can. Well, that's about it. I have some good shows coming up. Man, I'm looking forward to this next one. I won't tell you too much about it, but I think you'll like it. It's a classic Skeptiko episode. By the way, I'm also revamping the website a little bit, kind of adding some more things, but all that will come about in time, and you'll see it and tell me if you like it, and we'll see if we can generate some more interest in what we're doing over here on Skeptiko. So check that out in the coming days, or by the next podcast, I'll have more information for you. Well, then that's going to do it for now. Do take care, and bye for now.